Good morning, Inspector. Welcome to day 10. Just to say you are live on YouTube.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
So the inquiry's resumed. Just to remind people about the procedure again, that those who are taking part can have their videos switched on, and when you're speaking, just to unmute. But otherwise, everyone else should have their videos off or and also be muted. So and also about other electronic devices, if you can make sure they're either on silent or switched off to avoid any interference. Thank you. So just to say what's happened in the interim between when we adjourned on Wednesday and this resumption. I have actually carried out a fairly thorough site visit, albeit some of it in the rain, but I was accompanied by a fair number of people. There was a couple of people representing the town council. I also met Mr. Poole out by his house, so I've had a look at that, and he's written a few notes to just confirm what he wanted me to see on the site visit, which I think I haven't seen the notes yet, but he said because it was quite wet at the time, he said he'd just write these notes just to remind me of what he'd asked me to see. So I did see that area. I've also had a look round the whole site on the different footpaths and the other footpath that is now subject of an inquiry. So I've had a look around there. I've had a look at a couple of the sites that have been developed, which is Tent 1A and the site of Tent 1B, and also one out at Tenterden Gill. So and I've had a walk round on a suitable, well, basically the route that was agreed. So so really I feel that I've actually had a good look at the whole area now. The other thing I'd like to say is I have received quite a few documents also. So I've received the appellant's response to Ms. Reed's points, and so I'm satisfied that has hopefully been addressed in certain ways, albeit that there will be a difference of opinion on this, I'm sure. But I'll have a look at both these submissions and see what I consider to be how it reflects on the whole overall decision that I'll be making. And the other matters, I've received a follow-up from the SIL compliance statement from Kent. Well, it's information from Kent County Council generally, but there's also a little bit more information to which I requested at the time we were having the Section 106 discussions. So I've had a brief look at that, and it seems to give a bit more information on how these contributions have been arrived at. So I'll be able to take that into account as well when I look at the Section 106. The other matter that we'd discussed on Wednesday was the effect of the Section 106 on delivery, and I've had a brief look at the council's submission on that, and also early on this morning I received the appellant's response to that. So thank you for keeping to these timetables, albeit that I've only had a very brief time to have a look at it, but I mean they aren't long documents, so I have had a reasonable way of looking at it. And whether the two advocates actually refer to this or not in closing, I don't know, but anyway, it might be part of the closing statement. So I think that's everything that I can update you on. is there anything that anyone would like to bring to my attention before I move on to the next issue? Right, I've just received a closing submission, so that's the council's closing. So thank you very much. The other matter, obviously. Oh, sorry, Mr. White.
No, so I just wanted to say, in the light of you receiving that, it would suit my purposes and also make it easier for you at the end of Mr. Howell Williams if we could have our mid-morning break, because
Yes.
if Mr. Howell Williams is speaking, I will obviously seek if there are any additional points that I wish to amend my closing, I will do so. And as soon as he finishes, if we could have our mid-morning break, I will then send the closing, but it will hopefully have my comments, so you won't have to add anything yourself manually, so to speak.
Oh yeah, yes, I was intending to have a break because it's quite intensive anyway, the closing. So I would prefer it that way anyway.
Great.
The only other matter before I go on to the closings is this actual section 106. The one we did look at on Wednesday was fairly well. There were quite a lot of it was very draft. There were quite a lot of things that needed to be sorted out, but it looks as though Mr. Morgan might be able to help with that. Mr. Morgan.
So yes, the document that you've reviewed and we went through has now been finessed and prettified, properly formatted, and it's now in a clean engrossment form and was sent to Ms. Humphreys yesterday evening, and we're both in a position to accept that as the engrossment version. So it will be going to print prepared by the council, but we are now in a position so to share with you the full clean engrossment version of that for your consideration against the SIL compliance materials. So that has been addressed.
Yeah, and in terms of timing, I understand that the council need until Wednesday, do they? Is that the correct case?
So the window for signing would need to be longer than to Wednesday.
Right. I think Miss Humphreys has got her hand up, so maybe she'll be able to help with that. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Miss Humphreys.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Mr. Morgan has confirmed the position. That's all correct. I would suggest we do need perhaps 2 weeks, because I think the engrossment will probably be ready to be picked up from Ashford on Monday, and then it will need to be circulated between the various parties. So that will probably take a while. And considering that our sealing day is only on a Wednesday, that means we will have missed that for next week, I would imagine. So I think 2 weeks should be sufficient.
Right. So what we're looking at 2 weeks from now.
Correct.
So,
if Mr. Morgan thinks that that's fine his end as well.
Yes, that's consistent with what we've discussed, to allow the landowner signatories and the appellant to sign, and then make sure that the documents are back with the local planning authority for its next sealing opportunity, which would be on the 9th, which would be the date that we would anticipate completion happening as well. So we are seeking, sir, 2 weeks.
So is that, I'm assuming is that the 11th? I'm not sure.
Until the 11th, so yes.
Yes.
11th of March. So if we can say 11th of March by 5 o'clock on the 11th of March to receive that.
Yes, please.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And right. Anything else that I need to be aware of before I hand over to Mr. Howell Williams? Right. So I'll just get up Mr. Howell Williams' closings. So, and then I'll hand over to Mr. Howell Williams to go through them. Thank you.
So would you just bear with me just one moment. The closing statement is literally hot off the press, but so hot off the press, it's not yet reached my desk yet.
Oh, right.
I'm just
Okay.
waiting for it to be-
I've been quicker than you. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you're on soft copy, that's correct, sir. And what I'm going to try and do is put it on my screen, so I'll read from the screen. If you just bear with me for a moment, sir.
Or I don't mind if you prefer to have a hard copy, or how would you wish to do it?
I think
Because I don't mind having a
no, it's here
short
now,
German. You've got it now.
It's here now, sir. But thank you for
Right. Okay. In that case, I'll hand over to you then. I haven't got a hard copy. I haven't had time to print it, so it's I'll be using the electronic version. But if you can just highlight where you might go slightly off from this, if you do.
Yeah, I don't think I will be, sir. We're fairly up to date, and I've
Yes.
managed, notwithstanding the shortage of time, to include some short comments on the response note on delivery from Waits.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Mr. Howell Williams. So I'll hand over to you.
I can be heard. Start off by way of a short introduction. On our opening statement, on behalf of the Council, we concluded by saying that the Council considers that the claimed benefits of the appeal scheme are significantly and demonstrably outweighed by the serious harm that would be caused by the proposed development to interests of acknowledged importance. While reasons for refusal number 6 and 9 have been resolved through negotiation on the Section 106 agreement, the Council's overall conclusion remains the same, by reference to Section 38(6) of the 1990 Act and applying the tilted balance, planning permission should be refused. The statements of common ground set out that there is agreement on a range of issues. However, there remains much between the parties, as you have heard. As we said in introducing the case, building new houses and providing affordable homes is, of course, an important issue, and the Council has acknowledged a shortfall of housing land in the borough. The appeal proposal would provide up to 141 homes, including 50% affordable, which would therefore assist in reducing the shortfall to that degree, although the degree to which all of those homes can be provided, or at least provided within 5 years, is in doubt. However, set against that, there are important and weighty issues to be considered. In particular, the appeal proposal would seriously undermine the spatial strategy in the recently adopted local plan and cause significant and permanent harm to the natural environment, in particular, the landscape setting of the historic settlement of Tenterden. So we address the main issues, borrowing from those that were identified by you, sir, in an earlier case management conference. And I deal first with the effect of the proposal on the sustainable distribution of housing development in the borough. Reason for refusal number 1. The local plan's spatial strategy is to focus development at Ashford and its periphery, as set out in its vision and strategic objectives. Policies SP1 and SP2 as well. The reasons for this are manifold, including to support regeneration in the town centre and help create new communities on the periphery of the town, and because Ashford is the most sustainable settlement in the borough. It has a large employment area of its own, high-speed rail connections to London, as well as rail connections in 5 directions. By contrast, Tenterden is less sustainable. Whilst it has a range of facilities and a population size of just shy of 9,000 people, it lacks any rail connections and has only 1 bus an hour to Ashford, which takes 50 minutes, whereas it's 25 minutes drive by car. As the local plan inspectors noted, Tenterden is the second largest settlement in the borough, but the population in Ashford town was about 15 times greater in 2016. We should note in passing here that Mr. Marshall, on behalf of the appellant, accepted in cross-examination that his view that the appeal site is in a highly sustainable location does not find form in the transport assessment and was intended, he said, site in Tenterden. The appellant's case should therefore not be interpreted as suggesting that Tenterden has in any way comparable sustainability credentials to those at Ashford. The plan's focus on Ashford is thus based soundly in the reality of the relative sustainability of different parts of the borough, as the local plan inspectors noted in their report. It is essentially a borough of two halves: the largely urban area of Ashford with its strong sustainability advantages, where the main focus of development is intended to be, and the remainder of the borough, which is rural in character and environmentally sensitive, where there will be more limited development. The strategic approach is clearly very different, comparing one area with another. Mr. Ross, surprisingly, could not agree with that proposition and even said at first that they were not significantly different. But he did eventually at least agree that the approaches are different. Mr. Ross's argument that policy SP2 is only seeking to direct a bare majority or 51% of development to Ashford should, with respect, be rejected out of hand. The policy itself makes this plain when read as a whole, taking into account the actual distribution it sets down. A significant majority of the housing coming forward during the planned period is to come forward in Ashford, as seen in Table 1 and Appendix 5 of the plan, which shows 76% in Ashford. To contend that there is no breach of the policy because with the proposed development there would still be over 51% of development in Ashford is, again with respect, wholly misconceived. Consistent with the rationale for the strategic distribution, the local plan generally contemplates larger developments in the Ashford area and smaller developments for the rural areas. The appeal scheme for 141 dwellings is clearly significant and strategic in nature, and in this respect it is more in line with what the local plan intends for the Ashford area. This can best be appreciated by comparing the typical size of the allocations in Ashford with the typical size of those in the rural areas. Tenterden is the second largest settlement, but is not in the same league in terms of its sustainability credentials, and is noted to be constrained in a number of ways, including because of the high quality of its landscape setting. It is for that reason that only 625 dwellings were to be provided in Tenterden over the planned period, equating to some 5% of the borough's residual housing requirement in Table 1. The local plan inspectors noted this is not a precise fit with the size of the town compared to the borough as a whole, but consideration has to be given to constraints such as the area of outstanding natural beauty that surrounds much of Tenterden. The supporting text to policy SP2 similarly acknowledges this when it says the high quality of Tenterden's landscape setting and its intrinsic historic character are factors that suggest that new development in the town should be limited, phased, and very carefully planned. As the supporting text in the local plan says, referring to the Tent 1 site, an allocation in the Tenterden and Rural Areas DPD, and development more new major development is planned. Waits, the appellants, raised objections to the spatial approach at the local plan examination, but these were not accepted by the local plan inspectors. They concluded that the plan was sound in terms of directing growth towards Ashford, and there was no need to modify the approach to Tenterden. It can be seen from the above that the appeal proposal would far exceed what the local plan inspectors confirmed was suitable for Tenterden and what the local plan itself contemplates by about 24%. Windfalls are permitted by policy SP2, but they must be consistent with the spatial strategy outlined above, as well as with other policies in the local plan, in order to ensure that sustainable development is delivered in a way that meets the vision and the strategic objectives. The proposed development is of such a scale and in such a location that it cannot reasonably be said to accord with the local plan strategy. Its effect would be to undermine it, not only by reducing the focus on the Ashford area, but also by increasing development significantly in the environmentally sensitive rural areas of the borough. In this way, contributing significantly to the unsustainable outcomes referred to in paragraph 2.6 of the supporting text. The appellant seeks to suggest that the inspector user should grasp the nettle, acknowledge that housing delivery at Ashford is temporarily delayed due to Stodmarsh, and deliver at Tenterden to address the housing shortfall. This would not stop housing also coming forward in Ashford in due course when Stodmarsh is resolved, but at present, it is said, policy SP2 is not working. Additionally, the appellant argues that the inspector should reduce the weight afforded to the spatial strategy in light of the current lack of a 5-year housing land supply. In respect to the first point, this would not only be a clear departure from the development plan, it would also be short-sighted, given the prospective resolution of the Stodmarsh mitigation measures, and enable a strategically inappropriate development to come forward on a greenfield site on the basis of a housing position which is short-lived and resolvable in a sustainable way on more appropriate sites. That is not good planning. Moreover, as Mr. Ross had to accept in cross-examination, windfalls are coming forward, including in Tenterden, where there have been 226 windfalls, including Tilden Gill, which is already nearly a 40% increase over and above the local plan allocations. With regard to the weight to be afforded to policy SP2, whilst weight is always a matter for the decision maker, there is no legal basis arising from paragraph 11 of the framework for taking the approach to weight to policy SP2 for which the appellant contends. Paragraph 11 does not address weight. What it does is to indicate as a matter of policy where the tilted balance applies, which is a separate issue. Moreover, it doesn't change the statutory status of the development plan. By contrast, paragraph 219 of the framework does address the weight to be attached to the statutory development plan policies. Due weight should be given to those policies, even if they were adopted or made prior to the publication of the framework, but weight must be judged according to the degree of consistency with the framework. Closer the policies in the plan to the policies in the framework, the greater the weight that may be given. There can, we say, be no dispute that policy SP2 is consistent with the policies in the framework. In particular, in relation to windfall sites, it is consistent with the framework at paragraph 69 little c, which states that plans should support the development of windfall sites through policies and decisions, giving great weight to the benefits of using suitable sites within existing settlements for homes. It also directs growth in a manner which seeks to achieve the objective of contributing to sustainable development, paragraph 16. The fact that there is a shortfall in housing does not preclude a conclusion that policy SP2 is up to date and should carry full weight. SP2 expressly enables the council to address the lack of a 5-year housing land supply by allowing windfall development that meets the spatial strategy and other policies in the plan to be brought forward. As a policy tool, it is to be used to address the lack of a 5-year supply. and it is in no way inconsistent with the framework in this respect. The shortfall does not mean that the policy is out of date. The policy is there to assist in that very circumstance. In cross-examination, Mr. Ross agreed that it was possible for a local planning authority not to have a 5-year housing land supply, but where its policies are up to date and consistent with the framework as a whole. He also confirmed that he was not suggesting in this case that policy SP2 is inconsistent with the framework. His point, he stressed, was that the policy was not working. But it seems to us that Mr. Ross's reasoning is flawed here. It may be that there is a shortfall in the 5-year housing land supply, but that does not mean that the policy is not working. It is, as we've said already, expressly designed so that windfalls can come forward to address any shortfall. This is evident not only in the policy itself and its reference to windfalls and housing land supply, but also by reference to paragraphs 2.83 to 2.87 of the supporting text. Mr. Ross said in terms that the policy is capable of working, but more than that, it is working, and it is therefore up to date and relevant, and to be accorded full weight. Mr. Ross's approach to section 38.6 and the tilted balance, in effect, seeks wrongly to apply weight in a way that favours the proposal at 2 stages in each exercise. It's the council's case that full weight should be given to the spatial strategy in SP2 and the development's conflict with it in applying the section 38.6 test. Once that conflict with the development plan is acknowledged, USER can go on to consider other material considerations, including the framework and the application of the tilted balance. Our analysis does not mean that the shortfall in housing land supply is to be ignored. It is a material consideration in the context of other material considerations, section 38.6, and in the application of the tilted balance, the framework. The appellant has referred to the Oakley appeal decision, where the inspector appears to have not given full weight to housing supply policies because the policies were considered out of date due to the lack of supply. The policies in that appeal were different and may not be comparable to policy SP2. In any event, it is not authority for the appellant's approach. It's not been tested in the High Court and is, in the council submission, wrong. In any event, sir, we would submit that even if Mr. Ross's interpretation is correct, considerable weight would still need to be given to policy SP2, such that it would not, in reality, alter the ultimate balance. In conclusion, citing such a large development in this location would harm the local plan strategy, as it would reduce the intended focus on Ashford and cause serious environmental harm, in particular to the landscape setting of Tenterden. Policies SP1 and SP2 are consistent with the framework, and there is no reason why they should not be given full weight, and their breach should result in the rejection of the development. The appellant sought to argue that HOU5 was essentially a function of SP2, and that if HOU5 is met, then that would permit windfall development of this scale intended. There's no basis for that interpretation. As Mr. Ross accepted in cross-examination, there's nothing in SP2 to that effect, nor is there anything in SP2 or HOU5 that says that HOU5, so I think that should be a little a, not S. It's the first of the criteria. There's nothing in those policies that says that HOU5A is the main plank of the spatial strategy, as indeed Mr. Ross also accepted in cross-examination. The spatial strategy policies operate independently from the housing policies in the plan, except insofar as policy SP2 requires windfall developments to be both consistent with the spatial strategy and with other policies in the local plan. This scheme is neither. Policy HOU5 permits a windfall development adjoining or close to the existing built-up settlement of Tenterden, but only if all of the criteria, which have equal status, are met. That is a vital proviso. Mr. Ross does not dispute that the policy should be afforded full weight. The proposal fails against the criteria as a result of its environmental harm. In particular, the development would not conserve and enhance the natural environment due to the inability successfully to bring forward the proposed ecological mitigation alongside a development of this scale, and would not conserve biodiversity interests on the site. Further, it would fail by virtue of its scale, form and intensity to sit sympathetically within the wider landscape, would neither preserve nor enhance the setting of Tenterden, nor be consistent with local character. It would result in a large-scale intensive residential development on undeveloped land, forming part of a strongly rural edge that in its undeveloped state contributes positively to the landscape setting of the southeast of Tenterden. The reasons for these judgments are considered below, as are the breaches with other development plan policies. So I turn now to deal with landscape and visual amenity matters under your second identified main issue, the character and appearance of the surrounding area. As reflected in its reason for refusal number 2, the Council considers that the proposed development would cause serious and permanent harm to the character and appearance of the area, that harm being the result of several significant negative effects in terms of landscape and visual amenity. The objection relates to the whole development. Whilst the country park might be said to retain openness, the countryside at this important location at the edge of Tenterden would be transformed from a rural pastoral landscape to an essentially urban one because of the effect of the proposed built form, including the pavilion and the car park and so on, and intense activity. There are 4 short submissions to be made by way of introduction here. First, this is not a case in which the appellant contends that there would be no or even little harm in landscape and visual amenity terms. Indeed, it's clear from the appellant's assessment that there would be a number of significant negative effects. Secondly, whilst there is a great deal of common ground between the Council and the appellant, there are clear and important differences. The landscape statement of common ground sets out a number of largely factual matters that are agreed, but the areas of disagreement are fundamental. Thirdly, notwithstanding the findings of the LVIA, Mr. Smith, in his proof and oral evidence, sought to play down those findings, to the point, with respect, that his judgments, we say, on those fundamental matters should not be relied on. The evidence of Mr. Withycombe, on the other hand, should be preferred. His judgments, set out in his written and oral evidence, are fair and reliable. So I turn to you first with the importance of the appeal site. Mr. Withycombe describes and explains the value of the land in landscape and visual terms. In large part, he agrees with the LVA that the value of the site is largely attributable at a local or community level. His expert view is that the appeal site is of importance in landscape and visual terms. He notes that the LVA makes no suggestion that the land might be described as a degraded landscape, and he highlights the predominantly rural character of the site, the field pattern, largely intact from the 1850s, the enclosing hedgerows, the field ponds, the distinctive mature trees, including T381, the well-used footpath AB12, and the views to the east and to the west, including of St. Mildred's Church. Importantly, he concludes that by reference to its essentially rural character, the appeal site contributes positively and significantly to the landscape setting of Tenterden. The appellant has been quick to point out that the appeal site has no national landscape designation. However, that doesn't mean that it has no value or even limited value in landscape and visual amenity terms. That's made entirely clear in government policy. The framework says that decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment, irrespective of the lack of national designations. Valued landscapes within the meaning of paragraph 174A of the framework are not the only landscapes of value. Paragraph 174B, in terms, says that decisions must recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and of trees and woodland. The framework therefore makes clear, as a matter of government policy, that the appeal site has inherent importance as countryside. Mr. Smith accepted in cross-examination that this was an important element of government policy, yet he had not referred to it at all in his proof of evidence or in his oral evidence in chief. He therefore has not done what the government requires him to do. That failing being reflected, we say, in the value that he attributes to the appeal side in his proof of evidence. The landscape of the appeal site is also treated as important by policies in the local plan. SP1 is consistent with the framework by seeking to conserve and enhance the natural environment, including the landscape. Local plan HOU 5e similarly requires that developments must conserve and enhance the natural environment. Those requirements apply to the appeal site, even though it is not the subject of any national landscape designation. We note in passing here that whilst Mr. Smith agreed the relevance and importance of these policies, he disagreed that conserve means retain or protect from harm. His understanding was that the policy requirements to conserve the landscape can be met simply by minimizing harm. That policy interpretation cannot be correct as a matter of plain English, and because it would mean that any development would comply so long as harm was minimized, in other words, lowered or mitigated as much as possible, or as Mr. Smith himself put it, where we can. It seems that his approach to the acceptability of the scheme was therefore based on a lower threshold test than what is contained in the local plan or government policy. The appeal site is not merely countryside. It's more than that because it contains features of individual and collective worth, noted as being key characteristics in the local published landscape character assessments. As referred to in the Ashford Character Assessment 2009, these elements are across the whole site: a varied field pattern with smaller fields, a strong sense of enclosure from hedgerows and field ponds. As Mr. Smith agreed in cross-examination, they are part of the intrinsic character and beauty of this area of countryside. He also acknowledged that St. Mildred's Church is a prominent landmark feature akin to St. Michael's Church. These references to key characteristics should not be dismissed lightly. They enable us to define and understand the character and appearance of the landscape. They were incorporated into the Ashford Local Character Assessment, SPD, in 2011, which is now expressly referred to in local plan policy, enhancing its weight accordingly. Policy ENV3AH requires particular regard to be given to the SPD, with paragraph 9.43 of the supporting text explaining the general aim to ensure that new development does not compromise or damage landscape character, but instead contributes towards enhancing the character of the landscape character area in which a site is situated. That approach is entirely consistent with the framework, and as Mr. Smith agreed in cross-examination, the objective is of real importance. A further relevant point is that the landscape and visual amenity of the appeal site is highly valued by local people, adding to its importance. Recreational value is an established factor for assessing non-designated landscapes. Mr. Smith agreed in cross-examination that the right-of-way AB12 is well used. He also agreed that the views towards Tenterden and to the east provide significant amenity value. The quality of the landscape here has also been recognised by inspectors on appeal and in the local plan context. The inspector in the 1989 appeal decision found that the land was open countryside, part of a wider rural area which warranted protection, that there was no sense of urban enclosure to disturb or even qualify that finding, that Tenterden had a largely linear form and a significant element of its character derived from the close proximity of the countryside to the heart of the town, that the church, fields and hedgerows were valuable features of that countryside, that the landscape was important to the setting of Tenterden, and that views from the footpath towards Tenterden were important and attractive. Secondly, the inspector reporting on the local plan in 2010 found that the current appeal site contributed positively to Tenterden's strongly rural setting. These authoritative views should carry weight, and Mr. Smith agreed in cross-examination that they were relevant documents to look at relating to the same land. However, the appellant's response has been to say that the policy context has changed since those decisions, but that misses the point. The policy context may have changed, but the landscape quality of the site has not. Mr. Withycombe's aerial photographs show that the level and extent of development on the settlement edge has not materially changed, nor the field boundaries. The main change being that vegetation on the field boundaries and the site perimeters has indeed matured. All the above points, sir, we say support the conclusion that we invite you to reach, that the appeal site is of real importance in landscape and visual amenity terms. And we invite you to reject the appellant's attempts to play down that value. There are two matters in Mr. Smith's evidence which warrant specific comment in this context. The first is his reluctance to describe the appeal site as forming part of a strongly rural edge, words appearing in the reason for refusal. Mr. Smith has no doubt, he said, that the land to the east of AB 12 has strong rural characteristics, but disputed that the land to the west of the footpath could be similarly described. We make the following comments on that matter. First, Mr. Smith acknowledges that the land to the west also comprises grazed pasture with hedgerows, but concludes that it's more influenced by the settlement edge, and consequently, he says, cannot be described as strongly rural. He relied on two viewpoints very close to the boundaries of the properties on Appledore Road and Woodchurch Road, which, so we say, give an unrepresentative impression, and we hope that you will have appreciated that on your site visit. The second point is this. Mr. Withycombe agrees that there's something of a transition across the appeal site, with the land to the east of the shallow ridge being more expansive. But his view is clear that the whole of the appeal site can properly be described as part of the strongly rural edge. He considers that Mr. Smith, in his proof of evidence, has exaggerated the influence of housing on the settlement edge. There is an awareness of the settlement edge, but it doesn't exert a strong influence on overall character as asserted by Mr. Smith, especially when viewed from AB 12. The viewpoints he refers to support that conclusion. Thirdly, Mr. Smith's position on this point was confused or illogical. He considers that the Tent 1 site can be described as largely rural, but that judgment is surely inconsistent and incompatible with his reluctance to describe the appeal site as strongly rural, bearing in mind the uninterrupted views of the hard settlement edge at that location. You, sir, will also recall the description that he used in his oral evidence in chief for the views westwards from AB 12, largely a pastoral landscape. And you, sir, will also have made a note of his eventual concession and cross-examination that the land to the west can reasonably be described as largely rural. It is, of course, a matter of judgment, but the council is confident that you, sir, will reach the same judgment as Mr. Withycombe. now that you carried out your site visit. The second matter warranting specific comment is Mr. Smith's reluctance to agree that the site contributes positively to the landscape setting of the southeast of Tenterden, words appearing in the reason for refusal. And we make the following comments on this matter. As we've noted above, Mr. Withycombe is firm in his view that the whole of the appeal site plays a very beneficial and important role as part of the landscape setting to Tenterden. His view chimes with the views expressed by the 1989 appeal decision inspector and those of the 2010 local plan inspector. The value of the land in this respect is also reflected in paragraph 34 of the current local plan inspector's report and paragraph 2.51 of the supporting text in the local plan itself. Mr. Withycombe was particularly concerned that the appellant had not properly addressed this question. As he noted in his oral evidence in chief, the LVA does not address it directly. He was also concerned about the way the matter was addressed in Mr. Smith's proof. In his proof of evidence, Mr. Smith purports to address the question, but that text is not helpful to you for three reasons. First, he relies again on viewpoints close to the boundary on the western part of the site and on his consequent judgment about the influence of the properties along Woodchurch Road and Appledore Road. We've made comments on that position above. Secondly, the only other point he makes is his assertion that the site makes only a minor contribution to the setting of the settlement on the basis of what he called limited access. With respect to him, that conclusion seems unreasonable. AB 12 is well used, as he agreed in cross-examination. It does not provide limited access. On the contrary, it provides unlimited access to the public in order that they can enjoy the pastoral countryside and in particular the attractive views towards Tenterden with the prominent landmark church seen above the wooded landscape. There is therefore no sensible factual premise for Mr. Smith's assertion, the more so since he also agreed without the development, the use and enjoyment of the footpath will continue with much of the existing structural vegetation as well as the views of the church remaining. Indeed, his written and oral evidence on this issue appeared to epitomise the appellant's attempt to play down the landscape and amenity value of the appeal site. His conclusion that the site does form part of the landscape setting for Tenterden, but its contribution to that role is not entirely positive, is drafted to avoid a direct and fair answer to the question posed. Does the site contribute positively to the landscape setting of Tenterden? His answers to questions in cross-examination made things worse, determined as he was not to answer the question simply and fairly, not even to agree that its contribution is largely positive, a phrase which is entirely consistent with his view, eventually given, that the land west of the footpath provides views of a largely rural pastoral landscape. With respect to Mr. Smith, his evidence on this important matter was not fair or reliable. Mr. Smith's purported conclusion is contrary to the clear judgments reached by previous inspectors, and so we are confident that it will not be borne out, was not borne out on your site visit. So I turn to address the question of impact assessment. As fully set out in his evidence, Mr. Withycombe accepts that the methodology adopted in the appellant's LVA is consistent with current guidance. There are, however, some aspects of the assessment where he questions the application of the methodology and the conclusions and judgments reached, and these are set out in full in his proof of evidence. In these closing submissions, we wish to comment on 5 matters of approach that have clearly influenced Mr. Smith's conclusions. First, Mr. Smith says that all greenfield developments will result in some degree of harm. However, he was right to accept in cross-examination that such a statement should not affect the landscape and visual impact assessments. Impacts, their nature and extent, are specific to the site and development being assessed. Moreover, this is not a case where the appellant has carried out any comparative assessment in Tenterden or indeed elsewhere, so the argument goes nowhere. Secondly, there are a number of references to housing land supply issues in Mr. Smith's proof. Such issues should not affect an assessment of landscape and visual impacts. They are irrelevant to the LVIA methodology, as he accepted in cross-examination. Whilst the need for and benefits of the provision of housing are issues relevant to the planning balance, they're not matters for him, nor should they be a matter that should have influenced his assessment of impacts. Thirdly, Mr. Smith says that in relation to the scale of the development, the proposals include only 145 homes, or a 4% increase in the population of Tenterden. However, this is not a landscape or visual amenity point, as he did agree in cross-examination. The point is of no help in assessing the impact of the proposed scheme on the landscape setting of Tenterden at this location. Fourthly, Mr. Smith says that the appeal scheme is a dramatic reduction in the number of units and thus overall density compared to the 250 dwelling scheme. However, that is of little relevance where, as here, the development area changes little and densities in each parcel remain high. In cross-examination, Mr. Smith confirmed that the development area west of AB12 of the earlier scheme was about 5.41 hectares, and that for the appeal scheme is about 5.25 hectares, and only a 5% increase in open space. There's been no dramatic reduction or benefit in this respect, as can be seen at a glance in the design and access statement. In any event, consideration of the previous proposal or of changes since that proposal are of no real value here. You, sir, will be considering the merits of the scheme before you. Fifthly, Mr. Smith says that the LVA does not take into account the positive attributes of the appeal proposals, and the proposed master plan would result in an attractive, safe and distinctive place to live. However, positive attributes are taken into account in the LVA, and the conclusions reached regarding impacts and effects, as he accepted in cross-examination, albeit apparently not as fully as he would have liked. Turning to the question of impacts, the first thing to note is that the LVA concludes that there would be major, moderate, negative landscape effects in terms of individual elements and features and overall character. It also concludes that there would be moderate, negative landscape effects to aesthetic, perceptual aspects and other individual elements and features. As we've stressed above, the appellant's own LVA concludes that there would be significant harm caused in landscape and visual amenity terms. These would be permanent and seriously adverse effects to the landscape pattern of enclosed pasture fields and seriously adverse effects to the landscape pattern of enclosed pasture fields and settlement edge, to key characteristics described in the published landscape character assessment studies, to the perception of the landscape currently enjoyed so much by local people, and to key views towards St. Mildred's Church. There would also be the loss of an important avenue tree on Appledore Road, to which we return under a separate heading. Mr. Withercombe concludes fairly, and we say reliably, that the allegations of harm in the Council's reason for refusal number 2 are soundly based. In particular, he concludes that the proposed development to the west of AB12 is indeed large-scale and intensive. This could be appreciated simply by looking at the illustrative master plan, with houses and flats proposed at close quarters. Density comparisons can be helpful, but only where they properly take account of local context. The local context here is set by Woodchurch Road and Appledore Road, the distinctive linear approach to Tenterden, where densities are 10 to 12 dwellings per hectare on Woodchurch Road and 15 dwellings per hectare on Appledore Road. All the proposed residential development parcels are significantly more dense than these. Furthermore, the illustrative master plan indicates that the development comprises a series of setback development pods with prominent outward-facing streets that is out of keeping with the low-density linear form of the surrounding development. The DAS shows the nearest parcels to the settlement edge at densities of 40 to 45 dwellings per hectare, 30 to 35 dwellings per hectare off Appledore Road, and 20 to 25 dwellings per hectare to the east. The comparisons put forward by Mr. Smith do not assist at all. The circumstances of Tent 1, on which Mr. Smith placed considerable reliance, are completely different. That site is adjacent to the town centre, where there are many existing terraced houses and streets of relatively high density, as you will have noticed on your site visit. The development at Tilden Gill Road is also of no help, as it adjoins an estate mainly comprising semi-detached dwellings. Mr. Withycombe also concludes that the proposed development would not sit sympathetically within the wider landscape. His assessment is careful and objective, focusing correctly on the strongly rural setting of Tenterden at this location. Mr. Smith responds to this excuse me, by explaining that the landscape and visual amenity impacts of the scheme are mainly focused on the appeal side. This response misreads the reason for refusal. There is nothing between the experts as to the geographical extents of the impacts of the scheme. The appellant has been at pains to stress that the impacts are localised, but this doesn't mean that they're not significant or seriously adverse. He also concludes that the proposed development would not preserve or enhance the setting of the settlement. Instead, it would radically alter the settlement edge to one of a more defined, prominent and exposed residential settlement edge. The scheme would result in the loss of an area of open countryside, which is an intrinsic part of the important landscape setting to Tenterden. This is contrary to policies HOU 5, SB1, SB6 and ENB 3A of the local plan and paragraph 174 of the framework, which require decisions to contribute to and enhance the local environment and recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. These effects are profound and permanent, and of particular concern is the impact on users of AB12. We, sir, hope that your site visit will have been useful to you, sir, and revealed just how important the landscape setting to Tenterden at this location really is. Excuse me. The right-of-way is well used as agreed. It's also agreed that it provides a valuable amenity for local people. It provides attractive views to the east and to the west, in particular over a largely rural pastoral landscape with a number of open or glimpsed views towards St Mildred's Church. The proposed development would completely change the experience currently enjoyed by walkers. Whilst there would be open views to the east for some of the way alongside the country park, the pleasant views to the west would be replaced by very noticeable houses in the fore and middle ground. Whilst the illustrative design has allowed for 3 so-called vistas towards the church, these views will be short-lived as walkers move along the right-of-way and be dominated by the houses and residential paraphernalia on either side of the vista, sometimes very close indeed. To the south of the footpath, the proposed pavilion would, at 7 metres high, bear down upon walkers at a very close distance. The car park and the activity associated with the sports pitches also adding to the harsh environment that would be their new experience. There is no getting away from it. The effect would be transformation. The pleasure that local people currently get from the intrinsic character and beauty of this part of the countryside would be gone forever. And more than this, the appeal proposals threaten yet more harm. Mr. Smith claims that there would be ample space, he says, to accommodate AB70 at the western end of the site. However, it is abundantly clear that this would not be the case. The illustrative layout does not accommodate the proposed route of the proposed right-of-way, and the plans produced by Mr. Ross at a very late stage to show how it might be possible to accommodate it only serve to demonstrate the problems that would arise. The impacts in LVA terms would clearly be in excess of those recorded for footpath AB12, as Mr. Smith confirmed in cross-examination. In short, there will be no experience at all of a rural pastoral landscape, a proposition that he also accepted in cross-examination. So I turn to the third substantive matter, the impact on trees, dealing first with T43. Amongst other landscape and visual impacts, the proposed development would cause the loss of the mature horse chestnut tree T43 on Appledore Road. This tree is important. As Mr. Cook explained, supported by the evidence of Mr. Withycombe, it has individual and collective value. It's a healthy, mature tree of good height and canopy. Its scale and standing are evident in views of its trunk and canopy from near to and further away. Its collective value is also very evident, since it is a component part of the historic avenue of trees on Appledore Road that's now the subject of the TPO. Its loss would be serious in both respects: the loss of its intrinsic character and beauty, and the harm to the coherence of the avenue and the distinctive character and appearance of Appledore Road. The appellant has sought to play down its importance and the impact of its loss. Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith made a number of contentions on which we comment as follows. First, Mr. Jones hints at a limited life expectancy on the basis of some evidence of leaf minor in the canopy. However, he acknowledges that this is minor in extent. As he notes, there's no evidence of imminent decline or death, and Mr. Cook considers that there's no evidence to support Mr. Jones's supposition. It is in any event to be noted that Mr. Jones concludes that the tree could survive for another 40 or 50 years. Secondly, Mr. Jones asserts that the tree is visible only in short range views. However, this is factually incorrect, as Mr. Cook explains. Your site visit should have demonstrated that the tree occupies a prominent position on the outside of a corner and is visible in short and long range views. Thirdly, Mr. Jones suggests that other trees nearby limit the contribution that T43 makes to the avenue. That too is not borne out by what is on the ground. As Mr. Cook explained during the roundtable session, the tree, and importantly the vertical accent of its trunk, provide an important contribution to the pattern and composition of the trees in the avenue. Fourthly, whilst Mr. Jones accepts that the removal of the tree would create a gap, he contends that the gap would not be contrary to what he describes as the existing fragmentic avenue feature. That contention is to mischaracterize the avenue. You so will have seen that its original design is still intact. The gap caused would be very significant in near and far views, eroding the cohesion of this section of the avenue, especially bearing in mind that the tree is one of a historic pair. Mr. Jones accepted during the roundtable session that the landscape character of the avenue remains a defining and legible feature on the approach into Tenterden. It retains a strong avenue character, and T43 is an integral part of the avenue. In terms of mitigation, we comment as follows. Mr. Smith contends that mitigation would be adequate and prays in aid the caveat payment that Kent Highways has required. Mr. Cook was most concerned about that contention. The tree would be permanently lost from its specific location, such that there can be no adequate direct mitigation for this loss. Any replacement trees would require 20 to 30 years to have any meaningful amenity presence in the wider avenue context. In any event, the feasibility of delivery is not established. Whilst the payment can be secured by legal obligation, there can be no certainty of delivery. As Mr. Cook understands the position, no approach has been made to KCC Highways to assess the feasibility of what the appellant has in mind, and nor is there any evidence before the inquiry to demonstrate what could be achieved along the avenue. The only certainty is that the mature horse chestnut T43, one of a historic pair, will be lost, and a significant gap would be created at this important section of the avenue. The loss of T43 would fail to conserve or enhance the borough's natural environment, contrary to policy SP1B, and would also fail to respond to the prevailing character of the area by harming the character of Woodchurch, Appledore Road, Avenue of Trees, contrary to SP6D. It would not amount to a positive response to the character of the avenue, whose sense of place and distinctiveness would be negatively affected, contrary to SP6A. The appellant's scheme does not demonstrate particular regard for the composition of the trees as landscape characteristics, contrary to policy ENV3A b. There's also policy conflict with the framework, paragraphs 131 and 174b. I turn to deal with T381, dealing first with the importance of the tree. As Mr. Cook explained, this is a highly valuable specimen tree. It's an ancient tree, and that is agreed between the parties. As an ancient tree and irreplaceable, it is accorded the following protection as set out in paragraph 180C of the framework, which says that development resulting in the loss of or deterioration of irreplaceable habitats, such as ancient woodland and ancient or veteran trees, should be refused unless there are wholly exceptional reasons and a suitable compensation strategy exists. In the appellant's tree survey, the tree was described as ancient, lapsed, coppiced stool, multi-stem from specimen, member of a row of field boundary trees that together make a significant feature of the landscape. Essential component of the group within it stands of ecological, cultural, and historic value, of high quality and moderate landscape value, of long-term potential. Notwithstanding this clear acceptance that the tree is ancient, but no doubt with the strong policy test set out in government policy in mind, Mr. Jones, in his proof of evidence, makes the suggestion that the above ground part of the tree is not irreplaceable. This suggestion, so we say, has no sound basis, and we make the following short comments. First, the coppiced stump of T381 is part of the above ground part of the tree and would have possessed all of the dormant buds that now form the bulk of the tree. It is the same tree that formed part of a managed hedge for many years, but at some point in its life attained a stem diameter of 810. It is still extant. Secondly, no such distinction between the above ground part of an ancient tree and the below ground part of an ancient tree is made in the framework. Is made in the framework or in the Government and Natural England Forestry Commission standing advice on ancient trees, or in trees in relation to design, demolition and construction recommendations. Thirdly, as Mr. Cook informed the inquiry during the roundtable session, the authoritative work by Lonsdale devotes a whole section to the management of lapsed coppiced. Lastly, the suggestion made by Mr. Jones is not one that was made in the appellant's tree survey report, which clearly accepted that the tree was irreplaceable. In that respect, is clearly an afterthought by Mr. Jones. Turning to protection and the buffer zone. So there is a critical point of principle at stake here. It relates to the interpretation of the government's new standing advice. The appellant contends, in short, that the buffer zone recommendation is only a starting point and allows for flexibility and what they have called morphing. This is a fundamentally incorrect interpretation, as Mr. Cook explained, and we make the following points in relation to the matter. Ancient trees are exceptionally valuable. For that reason, there is bespoke advice in relation to their protection in the standing advice. In particular, the standing advice gives bespoke advice in relation to root protection zones, i.e., they are called buffer zones. The advice in relation to buffer zones is different from that for root protection areas for other trees contained in BS 5837, and clearly not to be read across. Ancient trees are a special case, warranting their own specific guidance on this issue. The use of the term buffer zone is deliberate, indicating an intention to provide separation between the development activity and the ancient tree, so as to ensure that no harm will occur. Mr. Jones points to the use of the word should rather than must in the standing advice, allowing, he says, for divergence. His morphing. However, read fully and fairly, the government's advice does nothing of the sort. It says that the size and type of buffer zone should vary depending on, but there's no reference to permitting a change of shape, and the only reference is to larger, not smaller buffer zones. Secondly, the recommendations say clearly that buffer zones should, i.e. denoting an obligation, not may, be at least 15 times larger than the diameter of the tree, and that this will create a minimum root protection area, in other words, to avoid root damage. Thirdly, the context makes clear that this is a fixed minimum requirement because of the exceptional importance of ancient trees. For example, it says that buffer zones should consist of semi-natural habitats, which a sports pitch is not, and gardens should not be within a buffer zone. If Mr. Jones were right in his interpretation, ancient trees would not receive the special protection that policy and guidance obviously intends. It's very telling, we say, that Mr. Jones was not able to present to USA any appeal decision or any authoritative document to support his interpretation. The most obvious reason for this is that the argument is not supportable. Mr. Cook's interpretation is the correct one and should be relied on. However, even if Mr. Smith's erroneous interpretation does not assist the appellant in seeking to demonstrate that damage would not be done to this ancient tree, as Mr. Cook pointed out, that the root analysis undertaken by the appellant attached to Mr. Smith's proof reveals indeed that roots extend out to at least 12 meters distance. So the evidence actually supports the need to retain a circular 12-meter buffer zone in order to create a minimum root protection area. Turning to construction, use and maintenance of the pitch, BS 5837 explicitly recommends that no construction, including the installation of new hard surfacing, occurs within the root protection of a veteran tree. The raising of soil levels, as proposed, would constitute part of the construction of the sports pitch. The standing advice, bespoke advice for ancient trees, is clearly more strict again. What has been contemplated by this proposal is not a semi-natural habitat. The impact of low-intensity grazing is not in the same order. A sports pitch requiring significant inputs and mechanized maintenance is very much at odds with Lonsdale's intention. So the construction of the sports pitch within the root protection area of T381 is not supported by the standing advice and would be a deterioration of the irreplaceable habitat of the tree, contrary to paragraph 180C. So the appellant provides no wholly exceptional reasons to justify this, nor any suitable compensation package. The proposal would also conflict with policies SP1B and SP6A of the local plan. And so if you might make a note there to cross-refer to the policies we referred to at paragraph 60 of our closing statement. So at this point, I'd like to ask Ms. Graham Paul to take over the reading. I hope that will provide some sense of change and release for those listening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I will turn to reason for refusal number 5.
There's some echo there. I don't know whether you're aware of it. Yeah. Have you?
Yes, sorry. Yes, sorry. We just needed to mute my Mr. Hal Williams. So, sir, turning then to the effects on biodiversity.
It's still got the
still
echo.
Feedback. We'll just swap places, I think. There we are. So hopefully that's better.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. So turning then to the effect on biodiversity, including the impact on the Environment Act 2021. The Council does not allege that it would be impossible to deliver enhancements to biodiversity within the site, and neither does it question the ecological baseline of the site or the surveys undertaken. However, the appellant has failed to demonstrate that it would successfully deliver the claimed ecological benefits in the long term, and thus the proposals would fail to preserve or enhance biodiversity. This is a site which has ecological potential, but the appellant's proposals are overly ambitious. They are aiming to achieve a biodiversity net gain of 14.98%, whilst at the same time losing 6.71 hectares out of 20 hectares of neutral grassland to built development. Furthermore, significant areas of habitat to be created are inevitably categorised as poor, by contrast with these areas existing moderate or fairly poor condition, for example, domestic gardens and the football pitch. It is not in dispute that the appellant needs to achieve a biodiversity net gain of at least 10% in order to comply with the direction of travel of government legislation, and in particular, the emerging statutory requirements under the Environment Act 2021. Mr. Goodwin, despite appearing at one point in his oral evidence to resolve from his written position, made clear, at least in his proof, that the proposals seek to resonate with the government's direction of travel on the environment. The relevant regulations imposing a legal requirement to deliver at least 10% BNG under the Environment Act 2021 are likely to come into force in 2023. Although Mr. Goodwin has referred to another inspector's decision, where the inspector says that for the time being, even a 1% net gain is policy compliant, that is not consistent with the delivery of a high quality scheme with scope for a margin of error. Furthermore, as Mr. Goodwin accepted, the BNG metric is only a tool and only one aspect of biodiversity. There is certainly no policy requirement to utilise it. Indeed, Mr. Goodwin suggested that many ecologists will not use it at all. He agreed that USAR are required to reach an overall judgment as to whether, given the significant losses, there would be measurable net gains to ecology as a result of the scheme. Whilst this therefore needs to be looked at in the round, the critical point is that there can be no dispute that given the extent of the proposed losses of natural areas, the BNG and the overall judgment on the success of the proposals relies on a very significant enhancement to what remains. Hence, the importance of being confident that the proposals would work and that the long-term maintenance would also be successful. Ms. Forster set out her serious concerns about the ability of the appellant to deliver the claimed improvements. In essence, the scheme is very tight and there would be no wiggle room, as Mr. Goodwin accepted. In summary, Ms. Forster's concerns, which must be considered cumulatively, are as follows. Inevitably, larger areas of grassland would be lost than anticipated through the construction footprint. Mr. Goodwin's plans Eco 3 and Eco 4 have taken no account of the inevitability of a wider land take and show habitat enhancement areas very tight to the edge of the built areas. It is true that there would be a conditioned construction and ecological management plan, but it is unrealistic to think that the construction vehicles would not impact on any of the grassland areas. Given that the residential development part of the site is in outline, the whole layout could change, especially if, for example, footpath AB70 needs to be accommodated, and the reserve matters approval, which would be based on a number of factors, not just ecology, could well result in additional losses. Recreational pressure could significantly impact on the quality of habitat within the site and has not been accounted for. The country park is a, and I quote, recreational resource of an informal nature, and users would have the opportunity to walk wherever they like. As Mr. Goodwin's photo 11 shows, even where there is a path with a hard surface, the grassland surrounding it becomes short, either through mowing or people walking off the side of the path. On the appeal site itself, the evidence of use of the contested footpath AB70 is apparent through the trampling over the grass, and you, sir, will no doubt have seen that yesterday on your site visit. Furthermore, residents within the scheme will want to take the most direct desire line to the country park and sports facilities. Some or many would likely not walk around a prescribed longer route in order to protect the ecological areas. This pressure is acknowledged in Mr. Goodwin's table, where he notes that directional mown pathways would be cut around the boundary areas. These soft pathways would be used to maintain foot traffic to dedicated areas, and he says discourage, note not prevent, residents from walking over meadow grassland on a frequent basis. That is all well and good, but the fact that such soft pathways are considered necessary is an indicator of the inevitable recreational pressure. There is also the added pressure of car parking, which might take place on verges and other areas of grassland. There would be further management conflicts in the enhancement of the grassland due to the creation of areas of scrub, where grass would need to be killed off around the proposed plants to enable them to establish, and also conflicts between flora and fauna management, for example, the inability to cut grass due to reptiles. In essence, the BNG metric has taken a best case scenario, which is unrealistic. The absence of any footpaths from the calculation in itself shows that it would inevitably be lower. No one has produced an alternative calculation. The council appeared to be criticised for this, but it is for the appellant to prove its case. Mr. Goodwin confirmed in answers to your questions, sir, that he had carried out some kind of sensitivity test on the calculations, taking into account the footpaths, which he said resulted in a 2% or thereabouts drop in the BNG. But this was not disclosed to the inquiry and so is incapable of scrutiny, for example, to see exactly which parts were included. The proposed footpath AB70 reflects local residents making their own route around the site, and it is more than possible that that sort of activity would occur again, further chipping away at the proposed net gain. So you, sir, have no sensitivity test or range before you, such that you can be confident that once Ms. Forster's concerns are factored in, there would still be BNG at all in accordance with the metric or otherwise. The draft LEMP belies the challenge of the ongoing maintenance of these habitats with regular grass cuttings and wildflower meadow establishment. The council does not take issue with ongoing management in light of the withdrawal of reason for refusal 6, but it is clear that the enhanced and new habitats would take some time to establish. Overall, in forming a judgment, given the extent of the losses to the existing species-rich habitat, it cannot be said, with the best will in the world to enhance what is left, that there will be overall improvement. Thus, the proposals would fail to preserve and enhance biodiversity, contrary to policies HOU 5E and F6 and EMB1 of the local plan. And so, sir, I will now turn and read the next section as well, which is the scheme's effect on the public right-of-way that is due to be subject to an inquiry this April. So the following matters are or must logically be common ground. Kent County Council have made an order to record the route of AB70 as a public right-of-way on the definitive map. Having satisfied themselves, there is sufficient evidence that there is a reasonable allegation that rights subsist, which is the statutory test in section 53(3)(ci) of the Highways Act 1981. There has been one objection to the making of the order by the appellant in this appeal, which has triggered a requirement for confirmation by the Secretary of State. An inquiry will take place in April of this year, by which time it is likely that this appeal will have been determined. The outcome of this appeal will, however, have no bearing on whether the inspectorate confirms the route, since the test for recording of the right-of-way is based on the evidence of long user and has nothing to do with the desirability of a footpath or the impact on or of development proposals. It is not for you, sir, to predetermine the likely outcome of the confirmation process. However, it must be presumed that there is at the very least a realistic prospect that the order will be confirmed. If the footpath is confirmed, it would be impossible for the developer to deliver the illustrative master plan, since the route would be physically obstructed by built development, which would be unlawful. In December of last year, the appellant, after having been asked to provide this by the council prior to the application's determination, for the first time produced 2 revised master plans, which rearranged the scheme for 141 houses in a way which does not physically obstruct the route of AB70. We will comment on the implications of that below, since they are not agreed, and these are agreed matters. If the footpath is confirmed, the scheme at reserve matter stage will either have to accommodate the route in some way or provide for a diverted footpath which would be incorporated into the site. This is possible, but to date, no positive incorporation of a diversion has been shown to be achievable by the appellant. The council's position is that whilst layout is a reserve matter, it is aware, as you so will be, that at the time of consideration of reserve matters, no condition can be imposed through that process which fundamentally alters the outline planning permission. Thus, one of the critical concerns is that the council should not be put in a position of being legally obliged at some point to grant reserve matters on the basis of a scheme that has dire consequences that should have been taken into account of at outline stage. This is why the failure of the appellant to show any acceptable layout accommodating the footpath or incorporation of a diversion is entirely relevant to the principle of the development. We do not suggest, as Mr. White pointed out, that this goes to any policy requirement, but it is a matter of common sense that the impact of the pro must be taken into account as a material planning consideration at the outline stage. First, because it has implications on layout which might be very significant and pertain to the principle of other harms. And second, because of impact, for example, landscape and visual impact, and also because of the implications in terms of the amenity of the right-of-way itself and the amenity of future occupiers of the scheme. To be clear, the council's position is that as a matter of law, the prospect of the public right-of-way must be taken into account. The appellant's position, however, is that the right-of-way is not a material consideration, at least at this stage. It argues that these matters can be resolved at the reserve matters stage, and it will work with Kent County Council to provide the best reserve matters application that will accommodate the footpath if it is confirmed. That is, with respect, wishful thinking. The appellant has failed to prove that these matters are indeed capable of satisfactory resolution. Thus, permission should be refused, because otherwise the council will be put in the invidious position of being compelled to approve a layout at reserve matters stage, knowing that it would have harmful consequences, but being powerless to refuse it. By way of example, Mr. Davis, who is the planning case officer, and Ms. Bezic, the rights of way improvement plan officer for Kent County Council, explained during the roundtable session the harmful implications of the revised layouts provided in December 2021 in more detail. The December 2021 revised plans appear to have changed the layout in a way which cuts back one development pod in terms of size. There is no explanation of the impact of the changes, for example, on flooding matters and unit size. Thus, there is an inherent uncertainty as to what will ultimately be able to be delivered. Furthermore, the route itself, which is shown to be surrounded by residential development, although not actually physically obstructed, is wholly unsatisfactory. Unlike a position where a scheme is designed at the outset to take account of a route and consider constraints and opportunities, this route runs to the rear of houses, avoiding active frontage and posing a crime and vandalism risk. It runs very close to dwellings, seeming to cut off rear gardens and cross parking areas. This would be unattractive, to say the least, in terms of the experience for the users of the right of way. As we've explained, it would damage the quality of the dwellings themselves as well by introducing overlooking. There has been no attempt whatsoever to place the footpath in a green corridor, as requested by Ms. Bezic, nor any attempt to show a suitable diversion outside the residential developments and any relationship with SUDs and landscaping features. The appellant sought to rely on the approach to footpath AB32 in the Tent 1 scheme, which runs through the housing. However, Tent 1 is obviously a much more urban setting and much denser. Prior to any development, AB32 was a tarmacked surface over scrubland. There is little green space on the site itself, and the route took into account the particular constraints and opportunities of that site. Furthermore, the scheme was approved several years ago now, in 2014, and the focus on providing high quality routes is now much greater. It is very telling that the appellant has failed to be able to provide a simple plan, which the council has asked for all along, showing a properly incorporated route or diversion, which would be a high quality, accessible route and sense of place. That was and remains a perfectly reasonable request. The fact that the appellant has failed to provide any satisfactory plan, we submit, can only be because there are real doubts that it is possible. Certainly, if the scheme is to ultimately deliver the number of houses even now being proposed. Consequently, there could well be significant effects further down the line in terms of the spatial layout and the number of houses that can actually be delivered on the site and or the resulting typologies, for example, in many more flats and fewer houses. It is unacceptable to grant outline planning permission in circumstances where the appellant has failed to show that any of these matters are even capable of resolution at reserve matters stage. It also casts doubt about the scale of housing delivery that can be prayed in aid as a benefit of the scheme and adds further weight to the landscape harm. So now, sir, I am going to hand back to Mr. Howell Williams to continue with housing land supply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning to housing land supply matters, as is agreed in the Statement of Common Ground, the Council's most recent 5-year housing land supply position is set out within the update document, November 2021. And the 5-year requirement is agreed to be 7,195 homes. The council's position is that, as is confirmed in that document, it can demonstrate 4.54 years of supply. The appellant has sought to argue that this figure should be reduced, essentially on the following 3 bases, in the order followed in the Housing Roundtable session. The most recent monitoring period captured a 15-month rather than a 12-month period, the impact of Stodmarsh on deliverable sites, and the delivery of sites, for example, S24. We'll consider those in detail below one by one. The monitoring period. The monitoring period was delayed in 2020 to 2021 by 3 months due to the exceptional circumstance of the COVID pandemic lockdown, which prevented officers travelling to carry out the exercise, and instead adopted a 1st of July 2021 base date, rather than the 1st of April date used in previous years. As a consequence, the appellant has argued that the council has not captured the gap between the 1st of April and the 1st of July 2021 period, and has artificially inflated the monitoring period and consequently the delivery figures by 3 months. As Ms. Goodyear explained, the roundtable session, and as was confirmed in the council's clarification note to the inquiry, the council monitors supply annually at a fixed point rather than monthly, in accordance with government policy and guidance. In the future, the period will revert to the 1st of April to the 31st of March monitoring dates, and thus the 5-year calculation will revert back to the traditional timeframes. Consequently, one of the monitoring years will only cover a 9-month period of housing completions. For the reasons given in the council's clarification note, it would be wholly inappropriate to, in effect, retrospectively alter the housing land supply calculation undertaken to reflect a longer 15-month monitoring year at this point in time. In any event, even in practical terms, the disputed 3-month period was at the height of the pandemic in early 2020, when construction and general housing industry activity was virtually stagnant. Any gain arising from using a 15-month period on this occasion would be negligible. The supply figure, 6,531, is thus robust. Notwithstanding this clear and logical explanation, the appellant continues to contest the council's published approach and has made a number of unsupported allegations of deliberate inflation, as suggested in the recent Litchfield's response note. So there is nothing dubious or covert in the council's approach, which derives entirely from the context and the practical implications of the pandemic. The appellant's argument on the grounds of generic statistics suggests an approach that the council should somehow be disadvantaged at a time when house building was stagnant across the country. In any event, and is common in such circumstances, their alternative approach is inconsistent with the framework and the guidance by introducing a requirement to keep pace with housing delivery every month. Come back to that question in the light of the recent exchange of evidence shortly. The impact of Stodmarsh. In July 2020, Natural England issued water quality advice which affects planning application in parts of the district, in particular around Ashford, to ensure that new development doesn't cause any further deterioration of the water quality at the nature reserve near Canterbury. The consequence is that a number of housing developments are on hold until a mitigation strategy is adopted. The council has acknowledged this and reflected potential delays in delivery terms in its supply figures, for example, by placing Stodmarsh affected sites in year 4 and 5 of the period. The Stodmarsh sites form the vast majority of the sites which Mr. Taylor has argued should fall outside the period entirely, scenario 1, or be delayed so that only part of the housing is delivered, scenario 2. The council has made significant headway in progressing interim measures in response to the Stodmas issue, as set out in its most recent supply update and its updated position, sir, which you have attached to Mrs. Goodyear's proof of evidence. A number of the sites are able to include their own mitigation measures on site, and developers are keen to move applications forward, even if they cannot be determined at the moment, as Mrs. Goodyear informed you. However, beyond this, the Council is taking proactive steps to deliver a solution at borough level. In other words, provide its own Stodmarsh mitigation strategy. The Council has set out a timeline within the 5-year housing land supply position statement. The SPD is due to be adopted this summer, and discussions are ongoing with landowners to progress the purchase of mitigation sites following the Council's agreement in July 2021 to pursue land acquisition for the creation of strategic wetlands. This has involved actively approaching the landowners of a number of sites located within the optimal areas of the river corridor. In a number of cases, this has led to detailed discussions that have progressed significantly, including preliminary wetland designs. The position statement acknowledges that a delay of 3 years for delivery of housing, which is ready for occupation, has been factored into the calculation to take account of the time required for preparing and implementing the borough mitigation strategy. As Mrs. Goodyear explained, developers are working on Section 106 agreements to make sure that everything is in place so that as soon as the SPD is adopted, these sites can move forward. In the light of this, Mr. Taylor appeared to accept that his scenario 1, no housing on these sites during the 5-year period, could not be tenable in all cases. In terms of the acknowledged potential delays, the Council has reflected this by putting the delivery in years 4 to 5, or 5 as per the table in the Statement of Common Ground. So we say that is realistic and deliverable. So for these reasons, the issue can reasonably be regarded as temporary and short-lived. You, sir, can have confidence that the sites will be delivered within the 5-year period. Turning to the individual sites discussed, in relation to VC 14 Elwick Road Phase 2, there's already a Reserve Matters application for the site, which is likely to go to committee on the 16th of March. There's no reason why, once the SPD is adopted this summer, that site cannot come forward as predicted. S16 Waterbrook has an outline planning permission, and the applicant is looking to develop on-site wetlands to develop their own solution. Discussions are ongoing with the case officer. S28 Charing North Down Service Station and S29 Charing land south of Arthur Baker are currently subject to a Reserve Matters application. The Reserve Matters application for S55 land adjacent to Poppy Fields is to be taken to committee in March or April this year and would look for a resolution to grant, subject to the SPD. As can be seen, all of these applications are subject to a grant of outline planning permission and are progressing to Reserve Matters or already have Reserve Matters approval. Given the progress made and the timing of the delivery of the borough-side Stodmarsh mitigation, there is clear evidence that housing completions will begin on site within 5 years in accordance with the definition of deliverable. In terms of the major allocations with no planning permission, S1 Commercial Quarter Tannery Lane is subject to an outline application which the Planning Committee resolved to grant. The Section 106 is in progress, and from discussions between landowner and developer, it's clear that the developer are taking on the site and building it out once the Stodmarsh mitigation is in place. S2, land northeast of Willsborough Road, is providing its own mitigation and is subject to a live hybrid application for determination imminently. It's clear that the developer is committed to the scheme since they have put time and money into providing the wetland planning application. S3, Court Lodge, S4, land north of Steeds Lane, and S5, land south of Pound Lane, are subject to outline planning applications for determination. They're also proposing to address the mitigation themselves on site, and the case officer has said they are confident the applications will be resolved this year. S8, Lower Queen's Road is subject to discussions with Natural England regarding on-site mitigation, and it's hoped to take the application to an early March planning committee. In their application, the applicant has said that they intend to be on site within a year of securing their outline application. S13, former Ashford South School, is no longer in use as a school, and the landowner is intending to market the site for residential development in the early part of this year, with an application submitted by the end of the year. Progress is being made towards the submission of a planning application, which pre-application discussions having commenced, on S19 Conningbrook Phase 2, and taking into account timeframes for the determination of the application, sale, commencement and first completions, part of the site is considered for delivery during the 5-year period. An outline application was submitted in December last year for S20 Eureka Park and will provide the Stodmarsh mitigation on site. The former B&Q site will also provide an additional 216 dwellings, which have a resolution to grant, subject to a 106 agreement, including Stodmarsh mitigation. The property developer, ABC, expects delivery on this site as soon as Stodmarsh is resolved. On other sites, progress is also being made on the submission of a planning application for S22, the Southern Extension Phase B. Mr. Taylor raised the issue of a covenant on the land. However, as Mrs. Goodyear explained, the landowner has confirmed that the covenant is not an issue, and progress is being made with initial feasibility and master planning work. We don't propose to set out the details of all of these smaller sites in closing in the remainder of the table in the Statement of Common Ground. The position is there to see. Essentially, the Council can show that there are planning applications in progress, including in some cases reserved matters approval, or cases where permission has been granted subject to Section 106 agreements being agreed. There are delays because of Stodmarsh, but there will be appropriate mitigation coming forward. Indeed, Mr. Taylor accepted that. No doubt, he said, there will be a solution that comes forward. Mr. Taylor's concerns seem to focus on the fact that he didn't know exactly what that solution would be in each case and how long it would take to implement and allow the houses to be built. However, with regard to the relevant policy on deliverable, the framework does not provide a closed list. With regard to the further guidance in the PPG and the reference to clear evidence, it's clear that the list is not exhaustive and a judgment is needed about whether, for example, firm progress is being made for the main test in the framework. The Council's officers who informed Mrs. Goodyear regarding the deliverable sites are the ones involved in producing the SPD and in the discussions with the developers about these sites and their mitigation measures. Several developers who are delivering their own on-site mitigation have worked out full plans for that mitigation. Having invested in that, they cannot consider the costs to be prohibitive. The Council's officers have the experience and knowledge to advise how quickly these sites can be delivered, and their instructions, which are published in the 5-year Housing Land Supply Position Statement, should be taken in good faith. There's nothing to be drawn from the fact that the particular officers were unable to attend the roundtable session due to being on annual leave as it was half-term, contrary to the unkind and unsupported suggestion made by Mr. White, and Mrs. Goodyear was perfectly able to advise the inspector on her own knowledge and experience and with instructions from the Council where necessary. It would be wrong to reduce the extent of windfalls from coming forward as Mr. Taylor sought to. Many windfalls will not be in the Stodmarsh area, and to the extent that they are, they can come forward as the Stodmarsh issue is being resolved and within the 5-year period. The Council can demonstrate a consistent rate of windfall delivery of over 150 dwellings per year over the last 7 years. This should give you future confidence. And so our conclusions on this topic. Overall, the appellant is unduly pessimistic about the impact on timing arising from the acknowledged effect of the need for Stodmarsh mitigation. The Council has built delay into its delivery position and has done so in a realistic, clear and transparent way. Its delivery of figure of 2772 should therefore be preferred. Mr. Taylor's scenario 1 delivery figure of only 200 dwellings from these sites is, we say with respect, untenable, and his scenario 2 also falls far short of what is realistically achievable. Accordingly, as per the position statement, sir, you are invited to accept a housing supply of 4.54 years, which equates to an actual shortfall of 664 units over that period. In the light of the above, a lack of a 5-year housing land supply, whilst present and likely to remain ongoing, at least until the Stodmarsh issues are resolved, is small and will be resolved in the near future. There is clearly a huge interest in building houses, particularly in the Ashford area, and the council are facilitating delivery wherever possible. Indeed, the housing delivery test has recently been published and demonstrates that the council is exceeding its delivery requirement, one of only 3 authorities within Kent to do so. The contribution of this scheme is thus not critical to addressing the shortfall. There are, and will be, other significant schemes within the borough which will deliver the housing on more suitable sites. Furthermore, it's unclear whether Waits are in fact able to deliver these houses promptly, should permission be granted. As we've addressed elsewhere, there are serious concerns about the impacts of the potential confirmation of AB 70 and how this will affect the layout of the development, which is perhaps the most striking example of the uncertainty surrounding the form in which the final scheme will take. In addition, as the council has set out in its recent note to the inquiry on the consequences of the 106 provisions, there are key triggers now agreed which restrict delivery and occupation. The timetable risks delivering at best only 71.92 dwellings, or half the scheme, within the next 5 years. Both of these matters pose real risks to the contribution that this scheme would make to the housing land supply position, and the weight to be afforded to the contribution of homes should accordingly be reduced. So we've recently received the response from the appellant to the council's note yesterday on delivery, following agreement on the 106, and it's necessary, having read it, only to make the following short submissions. First, it's clear that the appellant accepts that there are risks to delivery. Secondly, the text in relation to the 5-year monitoring period merely repeats arguments already addressed. Thirdly, the council, it is clear, does not share the appellant's optimism in relation to the sports field provision, being weather dependent, for example, the Secretary of State's approval process, which is not a mere formality as described by the appellant. It might take considerable time and would be unpredictable. Thirdly, discharge of pre-commencement conditions, which would, if any takes a glance to look at matters such as archaeology and drainage, take considerable work. And fourthly, the delivery of housing, including affordable housing, which is at a level here which doesn't warrant, we say, an increased delivery rate. And so in the time, we haven't been able to look back to the Litchfield's report relied on in the statement, but we would ask you to do that to see whether there is a proper justification for, in effect, asserting double the pace for the affordable housing. And you will need to look to the report to understand the approach to the average and the source for that average, which presumably looked at a range of sites. Next, the comments in the conclusions about weight are, of course, we say fallacious. This scheme is being assessed against the current 5-year period. The timing of delivery is firmly linked to the question of weight, not least because of the temporary nature of the current delays caused in large part by the Stodmarsh issue. So lastly, we turn to the overall balance and conclusion. Mr. Ross's approach to the setting out of the benefits is highly structured. There's no criticism of this in principle, but it shouldn't be considered as some sort of mandatory requirement. There's nothing in law, policy or guidance that says so, nor do the two decision letters say so. Moreover, a heavily structured approach would tend towards oversimplification, bearing in mind that the exercise is essentially one of planning judgment, where a single adjective will inevitably cover a range of degrees of weight. The criticism levelled at Mrs. Goodyear for not attaching a single adjective to reflect the overall cumulative weight to the benefits and harms was therefore some surprise, to say the least. Mrs. Goodyear's approach was perfectly clear. Having looked at all the benefits and harms, she properly applied the tilted balance with its own built-in adverbs to reach her overall judgment. Her conclusion is not only transparent, but so we would say it is also reasonable and fair. She rightly gives substantial weight to the benefits in terms of the provision of 70 market homes, albeit obviously less substantial now that it's clear that delivery would be uncertain and delayed. She also rightly gives substantial weight to the provision of 71 affordable houses, taking into account the addition of the additional houses above the policy requirement. These are the main benefits of the scheme. Others should carry less weight, and some limited or very limited weight. Mr. Ross's judgments on weight should be rejected for the reasons that Mrs. Goodyear gave in her written and oral evidence. Of particular note, of course, is that Mr. Ross gives only limited weight to the harm to the landscape. So in the light of the evidence, this is not a tenable judgment, and indeed contrary, we say, to the appellant's own LVA. We submit that Mrs. Goodyear's judgment is to be preferred to that of Mr. Ross. So what's critical to have in mind in this case is this. The main benefit in terms of the provision of housing to contribute to the housing land supply is, of course, a valuable one, but it's intended to meet a temporary deficiency. Building new houses is a pressing issue facing our society today, and the government has recognised this with policy support, in particular the triggering of the tilted balance. But decision makers should not be distracted by the need to plan for new housing in the general sense, and thus overlook the unacceptable negative impacts on the environment of a particular proposal in a particular place. The main harm in this case, other than that to the spatial strategy of the up-to-date local plan, is to the environment. In particular, the harm to the countryside and landscape setting of Tenterden is serious and permanent. The damage will persist even when the council meets its housing targets, and that is simply not sustainable planning. So in conclusion, the adverse impact would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme. The proposed development would not accord with the statutory development plan, and there are no material considerations to indicate that planning permission should be granted. Indeed, they indicate the opposite. Accordingly, so we invite you to dismiss the appeal and refuse planning permission. So that concludes our closing statement on behalf of the council, unless there's any matter I can help you with.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Howell Williams and Ms. Graham Paul. And I'm happy to adjourn now. I just want to remind people that there's no intention to accept any more representations other than the closing submissions of the appellant now, so that everyone should have submitted all their evidence by now. So it will be the last say is the appellant's closing submissions. I'm not expecting any other submissions to be made, are there? There's nothing else to be made after that. So what I'm looking at is to hear Mr. White's closing submissions after I've had a break, and then that will be the conclusion of this inquiry. So I'll just outline it at the end. So Mr. White, is a 15-minute break okay with you? Sorry, you're muted, Mr. White.
So can we just have a bit longer just to make sure the logistics, can we have 20 minutes till 10 to 12? Would that be all right?
Yes, sure. I'll adjourn until 10 to 12.
Sorry,
so,
10 to 12, yeah.
So the inquiry's adjourned 11 until 11:50, 10 to 12. Right.